Hello, welcome to ACC F3 Financial Accounting. Today we'll be learning about correction of errors. So this topic is literally about where we have to perform double entries and sometimes include a narrative to fix the errors that we have made while inputting transactions into either the ledgers or into the accounts or even in the trial balance or in the SOFP, SOPL, so on. It's very acceptable for one to create an error, as human errors can't really be eliminated, but we can fix them. So for instance, if a transaction has been input wrongly, let's say there is a credit sale of $400 and the person has forgotten to put in that transaction, obviously that's an error because then it will cause the debits and credits in our trial balance to be understated by $400. Sometimes a different error could be, let's say I've issued an invoice to a customer on credit and I should recognize a credit sale, but let's say I've already input the invoice into my sales daybook, but I've forgotten to update my trade receivables personal account. So that's also an error because that means I'm not debiting my trade receivables, instead I'm just crediting my sales alone. So that will cause an imbalance in my debits and credits. My debits would be understated by $400, let's say if the transaction was $400. So that's just a short example as to what kinds of errors we can face. And the first thing we're going to learn are the types of errors. And once we understand on the kinds of errors that we may encounter, then the next step would be to correct them. So we can't really just take an eraser and undo the mistakes that were done, because the mistake could have been made weeks or months prior, and the only correction would be by making an adjusting double entry to fix it. So let's get into the types of errors that we can encounter. So as you can see, I've listed down 5 main types of errors, and the first is transposition. Okay, so the first error is called a transposition error. A transposition error is quite easy to remember because it means that we have input digits the wrong way around. So let's say I have made a sales invoice of $264 to a trade receivable. So the error I could make would be to, instead of writing down 264 in the sales daybook and in the trade receivable account, I write down $246 instead. So I will be understating the amount that the person owes me. The second error is called the error of omission, which means that we have failed to record either a debit entry, a credit entry, or both. So again, let's use the same example where I create a sales invoice. So I'm supposed to recognize a credit sale in my books. So the normal debit entry would be debit trade receivable, credit sales account. So an error of omission could be that I fail to record the debit, so I forget to debit the trade receivable, or I could forget to credit the sales account, or I could forget to record the whole thing. So that's an error of omission. The next one is an error of principle. So this literally just means that we're following the wrong accounting concept or the wrong accounting principle. So I've written there an example could be repairs, which should not be a debit to the non-current asset account. So for example, let's say I decide to repair my machine today and I spend $100 on repairing my machine. So the right accounting principle would be to debit the repairs account, because now I should write this $100 off as an expense. Okay? The wrong accounting principle would be assuming that now that I have repaired my machine, the $100 should be capitalized to the non-current asset account. So I should debit my machinery account. But that is incorrect, because a repair is treated like an expense, not as a capital expenditure. It's a revenue expenditure. So in here, whenever we have a repair, for example, it should not equal to a debit to the non-current asset account. It should be debit to the repairs or expense account. The fourth error is the error of commission. Now this could be an error in totaling the amount, or it could also be an error of debiting or crediting the wrong account. So in here in my example, I've listed down that, let's say I have incurred a telephone expense of $200. So technically, if I pay my telephone expense, I should be debiting my telephone expense account and crediting cash, and both entries would be $200 worth. However, An error of commission would be where I instead debit the electricity account by mistake. Now, the difference with this and an error of principle is that in here we are still following the right accounting concept. Because telephone expenses and electricity expenses both are under the category as an expense, they will both be a debit figure and it's still the same thing. However, the only issue is that it's the wrong account that's being debited. The fifth error is called a compensating error, which in this case means that the error occurs coincidentally and somehow manages to equal each other and cancel each other out. So in here I've written down an example could be if the income and expenses are both accidentally understated by $200. So let's say in my books I've forgotten to record a discount received of $200, and discount received should be a credit entry. So that will cause my credits to be understated by $200. But at the same time, I've also forgotten to record a discount allowed entry, and it coincidentally was also $200. So a discount allowed is a debit entry, and because of that, my debits would also be understated by $200. So as a result, my debits and credits will still balance, but they'll both be understated by $200 on both sides. However, sometimes we may be in luck. Sometimes we can easily identify these errors from our trial balance because remember, we open a trial balance to see if our debits and credits balance and to also test if we've done our journal entries correctly. So the errors that can be highlighted by a trial balance would be the transposition error. It can be highlighted. Another one would be the error of omission. However, the error of omission can only be on one side. So if, for instance, I forget to record the debit but I do record the credit, then it would be obvious that my debits are understated and I can go back and see where I have missed the debit entry. The same goes for an error of commission. If the error of commission is also just one-sided, that means either the debit or the credit is not input, then I can see it because of the trial balance. The trial balance will highlight that error for me. Now, the next topic that I need to get into before we start trying some practices on how to correct errors is suspense accounts. Suspense accounts is a kind of account that's very different from the other accounts that we maintain in our books because a suspense account is only open for the purpose of either filling in as an entry for something that we don't know is for. So for example, if there has been a withdrawal of cash from the business but I don't know what it's for, then the opposite journal entry would be to use a suspense account. It's really just a temporary account compared to the other accounts like a cash account or a sales account. Those are permanent and they're always kept in my books. A suspense account is really just temporary. Let me show you how it's put into use. So let's say in our trial balance I've already added all of my debits and all of my credits, but then somehow they end up not balancing. So in here in my debits, let's say it's 100,000, but my credits only add up to 90,000. To make my trial balance temporarily balance, I will open a suspense account over here. And so this suspense account is just there to temporarily make my debits and credits balance. But I can't keep it there forever because that means an error has occurred and I need to go back and figure out where the error lies and try to reduce the suspense account wherever possible. Because in here the credits are lower, I'm going to put the suspense account on the credit side to increase it to make it match with the debit side. So because my suspense account is on the credit side right now, I can say that my opening balance on the suspense account is a credit $10,000. If I had opened it on the debit side, for example, then I would say the opening balance is a debit $10,000. So we always need to see what is the opening balance because that means I'm going to need to do the opposite to reduce the suspense account's balance, and I'll try my best to bring it down to zero if I can identify all of my errors. Maybe in reality it may be very difficult for companies to do so, especially if they have millions of transactions happening every day. So it may be impossible, but in theory it's actually quite possible to bring it back down to zero, or at least really reduce it to a very tolerable figure. So there are two purposes for a suspense account actually. One was to make the trial balance temporarily balanced. Another one would be to fill in for a journal entry where we don't know what the other entry is for. So in my example, let's say we receive cash $150, but we don't know why we received this cash or where we got it from. However, in reality, it may be very unlikely why you would have received cash being unknown. You would probably know why. But just for example case, let's stick to this. let's say we receive cash 150. Now because we receive cash, the double entry should be debit cash 150 and then credit something else. Alright? But let's say in this case we don't know what the credit is. So we're going to just temporarily use a suspense account to fill that up. So we're going to create a credit to the suspense account 150. So we're going to use this and then we're going to keep it until we figure out what the cash was actually for. So if we later on figure out that we received cash from a trade receivable, then we're going to have to remove that suspense account. So let's say we later on figure out why it was there. So we're going to have to debit the suspense by 150 and then we're going to have to credit the right account instead. And because we figured out it was from a trade receivable, we're going to credit the trade receivable account. Okay, and so now our suspense account is back down to 0 and we don't have a suspense account anymore. Okay, so now that we've covered some basic concepts on what kinds of errors we can encounter and what's the purpose of a suspense account, because it's actually quite important, let's try to get into some question practice. Because a good way on how to actually correct the errors is to, well, just experience it by hand. So let's read this question together. When Q's trial balance failed to agree, a suspense account was opened for the difference. The trial balance totals were debit 864,390, credit 860,930. So because they said a suspense account was opened for the difference in these totals, let's try to figure out how much that balance is. So we're going to need to figure out how much is the difference. So if you calculate how much the difference, it will be 3,460. And this balance is going to be the opening balance in our suspense account. And remember, we use a suspense account on the side that is smaller. So in here, the smaller side is the credit. So it will be a credit of 3,460 as the opening balance on the suspense account. Okay, the company does not have control accounts for its receivables and payables ledgers. Okay, before we go into the types of errors that were found, let's read the question first. Which of these errors will require an entry to the suspense account to correct them? And 2, what will the balance on the suspense account be after making the necessary entries to correct the errors affecting the suspense account? So, a good technique to practice on correcting errors would be to first understand what is the actual double entry that we were supposed to do here. What is the right double entry for this? And then when you have figured out the right double entry, compare it to the error. You make the double entry for the error. What is the error that was actually happening and where is the mistake? And then you compare the two. You'll most likely find that there's something missing, or there's something that needs to be put in, or there was just perhaps a miscalculation to the figure. So then you start the correcting double entry, and the correcting double entry will tell you whether or not you need a suspense account. So we're going to go through this step by step, and in each error I'm going to be writing down the right double entry, the error that had happened, and the correcting double entry to fix the error. Okay, so for the first error, it says here, in recording an issue of shares at par, cash received of $333,000 was credited to the ordinary share capital account as $330,000. So it's issued at par, so that means we are not getting any share premium, and whatever cash we received is the amount that we should add to the share capital account, which is not what they did, because it was supposed to be 333, but they put 330,000. So why don't we write down the right double entry for this first? So for number 1, because we have received cash, we are going to debit the cash account, and remember the nominal is 333,000. And then the corresponding would be to credit the share capital account, okay? Share capital account, because now our share capital is increasing, and share capital is an equity, so if equity increases, it's a credit entry. Okay, now all of these figures are in thousands, just so you know. Okay, now let's think about the error. The error just now was that it was credited to share capital of a figure of 330,000, right? And because they didn't mention anything about the cash, then it's a sign that there was no problems with the cash. The cash was entered correctly, okay? So here's a tip on questions that we usually encounter, especially ACCA questions. If they highlight an error to you, then that is the error that you should focus on. If they didn't mention anything else, like in this case, they didn't mention anything about the cash, then that means nothing wrong has happened to it. Sometimes they even tell you that there was no wrong adjustment to the other account, like that. Okay? So in here, cash has been correctly done, but share capital was not correctly done. So we can see that in the error, it was only credited 330, but the right one should be 333. So what does this mean? We just need to credit it again with the difference, right? So we need to credit this again, okay? To correct it, we just need to add to the understatement, because right now it is understated. So we're going to need to add a $3,000 to the share capital account. But then what do we put on the debit side? Well, on the debit side, cash seems to be fine, right? Cash has no problem. So what we use instead here is the suspense account, okay? So the key thing here is that whenever there's already correct entries or correct accounts, use a suspense account, because that's the temporary account here. And this account had been open for these errors. Remember that. Now let's take a look at number 2. Cash 2,800 paid for plant repairs was correctly accounted for in the cash book, but was credited to the plant asset account. So like I said, sometimes they like to highlight which has been already correctly done for and which one is an error. So in here they tell you it's already been correctly done, the cash that was paid has been correctly accounted for. So the cash book should have no problem. But the key word here is the but was credited to the plant asset account. That's a sign that that is an error. Maybe it's not supposed to be credited to plant asset account. Let's see. So let's get into the right double entry first for plant repairs. So for plant repairs is categorized as an expense. So because it's an expense and we are paying for this expense, it should be a debit entry to the repairs account. Okay, we're showing that we are incurring an expense. So we should have debited repairs by 2,800. Okay, and because we are paying with cash, cash is going out of the business, assets are going down because of the cash reduction, and so that should be a credit to the cash account by also $2,800. But remember, the error was there was a credit to the plant asset account by $2,800, but the cash had been correctly accounted for. So that means we have 2 credits, right? We have 2 credits instead of a debit and a credit. So this is obviously an error. We shouldn't have reduced our plant asset account, because a repair is not a reduction in the cost or in the carrying value of our assets. No, that would be wrong. That's a wrong principle, as you can see. This is a wrong accounting principle. It's the error of principle. Because of that, we need to now fix this. Take a look here. The cash seems to be fine, so there is going to probably need a suspense account, okay? But let's correct these errors on the top first, okay? So the right one should be a debit to the repairs account. So we should put that in the correction. So we're going to need to debit repairs as the right double entry. And now what do we do with this plant adjustment? We should not have reduced our plant figure. No, we should not have credited it. That is the wrong principle. So we're going to need to reverse it. If it had been credited before, now we need to just debit it. Okay, so we're going to debit the plant account, the plant asset account, okay, by 2.8 to reverse the error. And now it's not going to be balanced because there's no credit entry. We need to balance it out. So we're going to credit again the suspense account. By how much? By the total of these figures, which will be $5,600. Let's take a look at number 3. The petty cash book balance, $500, had been omitted from the trial balance. Okay, this one is a very short one. It's very simple. Now, the thing is, it's just not posted into the trial balance. The account is there. It was not just posted to the trial balance. Now, try to think, what side is a petty cash book balance supposed to be on in the trial balance? It's a petty cash. Petty cash is an asset. So it should have been posted on the debit side of the trial balance. Okay? but it said it was omitted. It's an error of omission. It was not put there, okay? So because we were just supposed to post it onto the trial balance, we would have just needed to debit the petty cash by $500, and so the corresponding would be a suspense account because there's nothing else that we need to credit it with. It's just posting the balance to the trial balance. But the error here was that nothing had been done, okay? Nothing had been done. It was omitted. So because the error is nothing had been posted, then we just need to do what was supposed to be posted. So this is the case where we need to do, or where the adjustment is exactly what we just needed to do. And that's the key thing about an error of omission. If the whole thing is missing, then all you need to do is do the double entry that was supposed to be done in the first place. Okay, so we just need to post the petty cash balance on the debit side of $500 this time. Now number 4, let's check number 4. A check for $78,400 paid for the purchase of a motor car was debited to the motor vehicles account as $87,400. Okay, can you see that their numbers have been switched? It's 78,000 is the real amount, but 87 was the amount that they put in. This is an error of transposition, as if it was obvious. Okay, because in scenario 4, it was a purchase for a motor car and was paid by check. So we're acquiring an asset by letting go of an asset. In this case, we're acquiring a motor car by paying cash. So it's going to be a debit to the motor vehicles account, and the amount was supposed to be $78,400, okay? And because we're using cash to pay with this by check, we could credit the cash account or bank account, same thing, and we're going to write down $78,400, all right? But the error was it had been debited by the amount of $87,400. And if we go back to the question, it says that the motor vehicles account was debited by $87,400. Did they mention anything about the cash or bank account? No. So that's a sign that the cash or bank account had been correctly adjusted for. If we go back to our error, there had been no error with the cash account. And as you can see, the cash account has no error, so that means the only adjusting would go to the motor vehicles account. So as you can see, it has been overstated by a difference of 9,000. 87.4 minus 78.4, there's a difference of 9,000. Because it's overstated, we're going to have to reduce the motor vehicles account. To reduce it, we need to credit the motor vehicles account. So we're going to have to credit it by $9,000. But then what will the debit entry be? The debit entry will be, perhaps you guessed it, it's the suspense account. So we're going to debit the suspense account by $9,000. Alright, we're down to the last error. A contra between the receivables ledger and the payables ledger for $1,200, which should have been credited to the receivables ledger and debited the payables ledger, was actually debited in the receivables and credited in the payables. Now, the nice thing about this is that they already tell you what should have been done. It's a contra entry. A contra entry is where we have to reduce both receivables and payables ledger by the same amount. So that's why they give you a clue that it should have been credited to the receivables and debited the payables. But it was done the other way around. So let's get down our journal entries first. So we should have debited trade payables by $1,200 and credited trade receivables by $1,200. But the error was that they've done it the other way around. So they debited trade receivables by $1,200 and credited trade payables by $1,200. Now, this is kind of like an error of compensation in a way, because the errors are on both sides and they coincidentally equal to each other. So let's figure out what this is. Let's say for trade payables, we're supposed to debit it by $1,200, but now it's been credited. So we need to firstly debit trade payables by $1,200 to bring it down back to zero to remove the error, and then we need to debit it again to bring it to the right side. So we're going to need to debit it twice, $2,400. Okay, one debit to remove the error, and then debit it again to bring it to the right side. So So the same thing will go for trade receivables. We need to credit it once to bring it to zero or to eliminate the error, and then credit it again because that's the right adjustment. So we're going to credit the trade receivables by 2,400. Now as you can see, no suspense account was needed for this adjustment. So if we go back to the first question, which of these errors will require an entry to the suspense account? We figured out it was numbers 1 until 4. Now the next question is, what will the balance on the suspense account be after correcting these errors? Okay, so we know that the suspense account has an opening balance of 3,460. Let's remove that. So in here I've opened up a suspense account and the balance brought forward, or the opening balance, was 3,460. Remember that 3,460 is the difference between the debits and credits on the trial balance right now. And we have created some correcting double entries, and we will see, will it completely remove this 3,460 or will it still cause the suspense account to be opened? Let's figure it out. Let's input the correcting double entries. So for the first error says we were supposed to debit the suspense account by 3,000 because we needed to credit the share capital by 3,000. So on the suspense account, it's going on the debit side. So I'm going to debit the suspense account because of the share capital error, and it's going to reduce by 3,000. So just a reminder that this is the first error. I'm putting the number 1 right next to it. Let's take a look at the second error. We needed to credit the suspense account by 5,600 because of the repairs and the plant account adjustment. So let's go back to the suspense account and edit that in. I'm going to credit it because of the plant or repairs, okay? And then I'm going to credit it by $5,600. Error number 3 says we just needed to post the petty cash balance to the trial balance. So we needed to debit petty cash, credit suspense by $500. So let's do that. Let's credit suspense account. There we have it. Now let's take a look at number 4. Number 4, we needed to debit the suspense account by $9,000 because of the overstatement in the motor vehicles account. So let's debit suspense. So we're going to debit suspense by $9,000. So now I'm just going to total this up, and then whatever the difference is, that will be the closing balance. So in here, the total will be 12,000, and this should be 12,000. So the closing balance will be the difference between 12,000 and these all add up to 9,560. So the difference will be 2,440. So basically now the closing balance on the suspense account is going to be a debit to 440. Our suspense account is still existing, and that means we still have some errors to go through and to correct. But so far, this is our closing suspense account balance. Let's try this next question as practice. The trial balance of C, a limited liability company, did not agree, and a suspense account was opened for the difference. Checking in the bookkeeping system revealed a number of errors. Let's read the question first. Which of the errors above would require an entry to the suspense account as a part of the process of correcting them? Okay, so I'm going to open the 3-column format again to help us learn on what should be the correcting double entries. Okay, let's start off with the first one. $4,600 paid for motor van repairs was correctly treated in the cash book but was credited to the motor vehicles asset account. So we've encountered this situation before. This is an error of principle because we are not supposed to treat it as a reduction in the asset value. Instead, we should have expensed it off. Okay, so it should have been a debit to the repairs account, right? Because it's a repairs expense. So we should have debit to the repairs account, and we should credit the cash book because we are paying for the repairs with our cash, and so cash is going out and it's a reduction. And repairs is an expense. Now it says it was correctly treated in the cash book. So if it was correctly treated in the cash book, this would have no error. It would follow the right double entry, but the error was that it was credited to the motor vehicles asset account instead. So there is no debit entry. They're both credit entries. So this is going to the motor vehicles asset account. So we will need to debit the repairs to input the right adjustment, right? Because that's the right entry. We should debit repairs. And now we need to reverse the motor vehicle entry. So because it has been credited before, we will now need to debit motor vehicles. And what will the credit be? The credit will be a suspense account, okay? Because there was no problem with the cash account, and so suspense account will do. Now let's take a look at error number 2. Error number 2 says $360 was received from B, who is a customer, was credited in error to the account of BB. So perhaps BB is another customer. Okay. So it was credited. Well, let's think about the right double entry first. If we receive cash, that means cash account will be debited. Okay. Cash account will be debited by 360, and we should have credited B's account because B is the trade receivable. Because he has paid us, his debt will go down. Okay. But the error was we still received cash. There's no sign that cash was wrongly adjusted, so we're going to follow the right double entry, but it was credited in error to BB's account. Okay, so BB was reduced by 360, but B's account was not reduced by 360. So how are we going to fix this? We need to add back BB's account. Okay, BB still owes us that 360, so we should not have reduced BB's account. So we're going to add back by debiting BB's account. So we're going to need to debit BB's account by $360 to remove the error completely. But then, at the same time, credit B's account by $360 to reduce his balance. Let's take a look at number 3. $9,500 paid for rent was debited to the rent account as $5,900. So, again, these digits are switched, so this should be an error of transposition. If in number 2, that would be an error of commission because it was a wrong account. So number 3 is an error of transposition, just the numbers are switched. Let's write down the right double entry. So in here, it says we paid for rent. Paying for rent. Rent is an expense in this case, so expenses will increase. So we should debit the rent account by $9,500, and we will need to credit cash because cash is going out by $9,500. But the error was it was debited to the rent account as $5,900. So instead of debiting $9,500, it was debited $5,900. And cash doesn't seem to have any issue because they didn't point it out. So this would be at the correct figure. So as you can see, the rent has been understated by $3,600. So now all we need to do is charge more to the rental expense account. So we are going to need to debit again to the rent account by the difference, which is $3,600. Now because cash has no issue, we will use a suspense account to balance it out. Now number 4, the total of the discount allowed column in the cash book had been debited in error to the discount received account. So from this question itself, they're saying that discount allowed column has been debited in error to the discounts received. Okay, what is discount allowed usually? Discount allowed is treated like an expense because we are giving a reduction in how much we should have been receiving. So discounts allowed should be a debit entry. Okay, now the corresponding entry, because we're giving discounts, who are we giving them to? We're giving them to trade receivables. So we should credit our trade receivables. But in here the error was debited in error to the discounts received. So we instead debited discounts received, and let's say maybe there's no issue with the trade receivables. So now as you can see, there is a wrong account. If it's a wrong account, then it's an error of commission. So we need to firstly debit the right account, which is discount allowed, okay? And we need to reverse what happened here. So if it was debited before, we need to credit the discount received account. Now let's take a look at the last error. No entries have been made to record a cash sale. No entries have been made. That's an error of omission. Now what is the right double entry if we were to record a cash sale? Cash sale, we're receiving cash. So if cash increases, that's a debit to the cash account. And it's a sale. So sale is a credit entry. So we should credit to sales account. But the error was no entries have been made to record it at all. If it had missing the debit, they would have said maybe you didn't update the cash account or the cash book. So this would be empty. There is no input. So because of that, it's quite simple. All we need to do is do what we were supposed to do. So debit the cash account by $100 and then credit the sales account by $100. So to answer the question, which of these errors will require a suspense account? Number 5 does not require a suspense account. Numbers 4 does not require a suspense account. Number 3 does. Number 2 does not require a suspense account, but number 1 does. So the answer is errors 1 and 3 need a suspense account for correction. The debit side of a trial balance totals $800 more than the credit side. Which one of the following errors would fully account for the difference? Well, to answer this question, I would just be making the double entries of the errors, okay? Because they're asking which of these errors, A, B, C, or D, would cause the debit side of the trial balance to be $800 more than the credit side. So let's try A. What happens in A? $400 paid for plant maintenance has been correctly entered in the cash book, but credited to the plant asset account. Okay, so the error in this case, if we're paying for plant maintenance is an expense. We should have debited plant maintenance and credited cash because we're paying cash. So in here, the cash book would be credited by 400, but the error was it was credited to plant asset account. Okay, this is the error here. So, does this cause the debit side to be $800 more than the credit side? No. This causes the credit side to be bigger than the debit side by $800. So A is not the answer. Let's try B. Discount received 400 has been debited to discount allowed. Okay, discount received is a credit entry. Okay, discount allowed is a debit entry because discount received is a sort of like a other income to us. So if we had debited discount allowed instead, then we would have debited discount allowed account of 400, and then we would have credited whom? Discount received we receive from our trade payables. So this should be credit discount received, debit trade payables. So there is no credit entry actually, because the other entry would have been debiting trade payables by 400. So if this was the error that was done, this does cause the debits to be greater than the credits. So we figured out that B is a potential answer. If we take a look at C, a receipt of 800 for commission receivable has been omitted from the records. So this entire transaction is missing. And because this entire transaction is missing, the debits and the credits would still balance, but it would be understated by 800 on both sides because it's missing. What about D? The petty cash balance of 800 has been omitted from the trial balance. Petty cash balance, we've encountered, a petty cash is an asset, so it should be a debit entry. If it is missing from the trial balance, that means the debits would be understated by 800, and that will cause the credits to be bigger. So the debits are understated by 800. But the question is saying that the debits is 800 more than the credit side. So D is also not an option. So our answer is B. We have come to the end of this chapter. Thank you for watching.